The G20 summit is taking place in Rome this weekend, and it'll see the world's largest 20 economies holding their first face-to-face meeting at leader level for 2 years. COVID will undoubtedly dominate the agenda, but it could initial signs of progress on climate issues emerge this weekend, or just disagreement? All of which, of course, is taking place before the start of COVID. Well, joining me now to discuss this are Michele Geraci. She's a former Under-Secretary of State at the Italian Ministry of Economic Development, and Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri, Director of the US and Americas Programme at Chatham House, the Foreign Affairs think tank. And Dr. Vinjamuri, it's rather odd, isn't it? This whole G20 idea started when countries were desperate to do something after the banking crisis, and there's pretty much a lot of agreement. This time round, more disagreement between them, I would think. What do you think?
Well, absolutely. I think that there's a lot of contention here. The big issues clearly, though, are, I think, very significant, which is getting agreement at the G20 on what we've already seen preliminarily agreed at the OECD, which is the global minimum corporate tax rate. And from a US perspective, this is very significant. It speaks to Biden's entire domestic agenda, which is preventing that race to the bottom, demonstrating that he cares about inequality, being able to signal that to his domestic audience on the back of what looks like an achievement on getting his Build Back Better agenda whittled down significantly, but still with some really significant climate provisions as he travels to the G20 and then, of course, to COP26. But I think the other thing to note, Adam, is the presence virtually, but the absence of the leader of China, very significant here. And it allows, again, it's a big opening for the US president to reclaim the mantelpiece of global leadership after what has been a very rocky couple of months.
Michele Geraci, it's a pretty tough task for the Italians chairing this summit at this time, isn't it?
It is indeed a challenge, but it is positive that at least there is a face-to-face meeting with some absentees, yes, but for reasons that we can discuss. It is challenging, but I do like the G20. I've attended a couple of them in the past few years, which is different from the G7. The G7 is like-minded countries. Now, when you do have meetings with like-minded people, you walk into the room with one idea and you leave the room pretty much with the same idea. So there's not much progress. Now, the G20 does have challenges because indeed, as we heard, people come from different points of views, different positions. And so the meeting is both more challenging, but also more interesting. And this is really what happens over the next few hours that could make those positions a little bit closer. I don't worry too much about the details, because then every country goes back and they pretty much do things that they like, they implement the policies as they see fit, but at least there is a general framework. For example, on climate change, okay, do we need to debate if the carbon neutrality is between 2050 and 2060? It probably makes little difference. The important thing is to agree how to do it. So the policies to cut carbon, to have taxes, to implement electrification of transport, by the same time the supply, how solar panel and wind power generator can be exported, for example, from China. Because China is, in terms of climate change, the good news is that it is both the problem, because it is the highest emitter of CO2, and therefore it is also the solution. So at the same time, we need to make sure that we bring to the table countries with different level of development. And the debate here is very difficult, because emerging markets say, well, you guys in the West have polluted the world in the 50s and 60s, and now the burden of cutting emission falls on us. I think the solution is to do a little bit of a transfer of funds to help those emerging markets transit from a carbon economy to a green economy without making the economic potential suffer.
As we speak, we're seeing pictures of Vatican City, St. Peter's Square, where we're expecting President Biden, to arrive for his first meeting as president with the Pope. Dr. Vinjamuri, do you think that perhaps this letter from Gordon Brown and John Bruton and other world leaders offers this G20 an easy win to say, yes, we will give surplus vaccines to poorer countries?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a start. This has been the deficit on the global stage, the extreme vaccine inequality, the failure, even when we've seen pledges to actually deliver and implement them. That is really been quite shocking, and it will be very visible at COP26 after the G20, as we know that many participants are coming from places where the vaccine rate is very small at the same time that we are all looking for our booster shots. So I think that that agenda is, potentially an easy win, but people are really looking for implementation, and that's the key thing. To your broader point, whether the G20 can really speak to what Joe Biden and others at the G7 referred to as the Build Back Better World agenda, which again, so far has really looked like a shell without a lot of filling in the parts, and vaccine distribution is part of that, climate finance, but really beginning to talk about a plan for infrastructure investment. So a number of issues that the developed world needs to think about when it looks to the developing world. But some of this is divisive, of course, because even though the G20 seeks to bring together the US and China and many other players, there's still a tremendous amount of competition geopolitically, and that is also something that plays out when it comes to delivering on those big global public goods.
Ms. Geraci, what in particular are the Italian hosts looking for from the G20, which they would regard as showing that this has been a successful chairmanship?
The restoring of positive economic relationship, the solution of global supply chain, rejuvenate trade, and lower down the geopolitical tensions. For Italy, particularly, we are an economy which is driven by export. 1/3 of our GDP comes from export. So I do know that Prime Minister Draghi is, of course, concerned both about the pandemic issue, which is now almost being solved, but the economic situation needs a little bit of work. And so trade for Italy will be important. I've spoken to the Director General of the WTO a few weeks ago. There is a total commitment in Geneva by Director Ngozi to move on with trade as a source to make people flip the equation. We are all with each other, both competitors and partners. And we really need to focus on the latter one. And I do think that would be the victory for Draghi to boost an agreement, or at least a opening up light out of the tunnel on the economic and trade, which will be important for all countries, but particularly for us in Italy.
And on that note, do you think there's any chance that Mario Draghi will bang the heads together of President Macron and Prime Minister Johnson over the fish question?
I think these are more thorny issues that those need to be discussed, from my experience, in bilateral, because we cannot bring India, China, Mexico, and so on to talk about our own little minutiae. It is important, but not for the G20.
We're just seeing pictures preparing for President Biden to arrive. Dr. Vinjamuri, he is claiming success with his Build Back Better agenda on climate change and in other areas as he comes to Europe. Is he justified in doing that?
I think he is. I mean, we all know it's been whittled down very dramatically from that $3.5 trillion ambition to about 1.85. It still has an amount of investment in climate that we haven't seen in the United States. So I think this is very, very significant. And really just the fact that he can demonstrate that in the context of what the world knows has been a very divided America, a very divided Congress, a very divided Democratic Party, that he's been able to actually forge what looks like an agreement that will go through. And that he can also, in doing this, signal to Americans that America's role on the global stage still matters. It's been very much in doubt for several years. And remember, Americans have a very healthy ego when it comes to US leadership abroad. So there are multiple things going on for this president in this visit that are very significant. But I do think that forging that deal has been absolutely critical, and it will make or break his presidency, I'm sure.
Well, the preliminary motorcade arriving. I haven't quite seen the president yet. But, Ms. Geraci, Joe Biden said America is back with his presidency. Is that how it looks from Rome?
It is, of course, every country chooses the leaders that they see fit. America is a democratic country. They have decided to change leadership. I am very positive and I do strongly support the Build Back Better World initiative. The world needs development of infrastructure, Asia, Africa. So if Joe Biden can be, let's say, the leader of the Western world to do something which is, again, not in competition, but complementary to, for example, the Belt and Road in China, that is excellent news. We don't really need to win or lose. I think people around the world, they all want the same thing: wake up in the morning, send the children to school, earn, go back in peace and safely. And there are many people around the world that do not have access to basic infrastructure. So if Biden wants to use the BBB initiative to bring America back as a world leader, this time in developing infrastructure outside of the United States and in the United States that needs it first, that is an excellent idea. And I do know that Europe and Italy in particular would very much welcome this initiative and cooperate. We do have construction companies, energy companies that can build roads, infrastructure, agricultural machinery for Africa. But as we said, we must turn these numbers into facts, so not leave it as an empty shell. So hopefully something will come out of this, but again, it needs to be, again, a world initiative. We cannot have the West compete with East and the North compete with the South. Otherwise, everyone then goes back home feeling maybe not mistreated, but being left behind. We cannot have a first division and a second division group of countries. Today is G20. Everyone ranks pari passu, equal ranking. Small countries are just as important as large countries. We leave to bilateral agreement, discussion on the specifics.
And Dr. Vigimuri, we're seeing pictures from inside the Vatican of Joe Biden arriving to meet the Pope. Obviously, this is a symbolic occasion. They're both important leaders, but Joe Biden is only the second Roman Catholic American president. What is the significance of this meeting and perhaps the pitfalls, given that issues such as abortion are so sensitive with the domestic audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think that President Biden will really seek to focus on those issues in which the Pope and the president agree very much. Poverty relief and being right up there at the top, but a real commitment to globalism, to development. I think that the question of a woman's right to choose is, as we know, very divisive right now. That case in Texas that's going back and forth will go to the Supreme Court. The president is going to want to manage the optics around that very carefully, I think, and focus much more on the positive agenda. And there is this identity commitment between the two of them, faith. And I think that certainly, again, the president is here to lead on the global stage, but he's also always speaking to his home audience. So it has the potential to be a very significant meeting. It also has the potential to raise what is a very controversial and high stakes issue right now in the United States.
And probably personally, if not necessarily with the institutions they represent, this Pope and Joe Biden pretty much on the same page.
Yeah, no, I think very, very much an affinity there. And we've seen this with Joe Biden, time and again. There's so many people, because he's been in Washington for so long, vice president in the Senate. Many of these relationships that he is now taking on board as president are not new. He's got deep history. This is certainly an important one. And it matters, I think, for navigating what are some very contentious issues when you've got that diplomacy back. And remember, very difficult to forget, but it has been about 9 months that the 4 years of Donald Trump's leadership were very, very different. We're now so much focused on the internal battles, on the global geopolitical competition, on COVID and climate, that we sometimes forget how rocky America's role was on these past trips for the past 4 years prior to this administration. So this is a very different experience for America, for the world, certainly for this U.S. president.
Okay, stay with us. This is Sky News and All Out Politics. It's 11 a.m. in the UK, 12 noon in Rome. This is Vatican City, the arrival of the motorcade of President Joe Biden, who's going to have a meeting with the Pope ahead of the G20 summit, which he's also attending. And then, of course, he'll be flying on to the COP26 meeting in Glasgow in Scotland. The Beast, the presidential limousine, has now drawn up in Vatican City. You can see President Biden there with a mask on, now taking it off. Swiss guards were lining St. Peter's Square as he crossed it. We see a Swiss guard there and this reception. It's quite remarkable, actually, that the Vatican have a pretty slick communications team for these events, getting out both pictures and also words of what has been discussed when leaders meet together. As we were saying for President Biden, this is perhaps particularly significant since he himself is a member of the Catholic Church and continues to go to Mass every Sunday as president. Secret Service waiting for clearance for the president to come out, and we will stick with these live pictures as we continue to discuss the G20 and President's State of International Diplomacy with Michele Geraci, who is a former Undersecretary of State at the Italian Ministry of Economic Development, and also Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri. We always forget on these occasions, to a certain extent, as outsiders, that what we're seeing from the Vatican, Michele Geraci, this is not Italy, this is the Vatican, a different country.
Is indeed too a small country. We do not have border control, but of course the procedures for hosting and welcoming world leaders is a little bit different. Here is a president coming out. I'll leave it to you, perhaps.
Being greeted in the Vatican on behalf of the Pope, of course, both Joe Biden and the Pope are fairly elderly gentlemen, so I don't think they'll be meeting on the steps. That's not, anyway, the papal style. Jill Biden wearing mantequilla, the veil, which is normally worn by women at the audiences with the Pope.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Jill's husband. Thank you.
Well, the Cardinal leading the President and First Lady in now for their audience with the Pope. And if this goes to the form of previous visits, which I've seen, by leaders to see His Holiness, we get some pictures fairly soon of the two of them talking. I remember when Tony Blair went to see the Pope, he took along his wife, and also she took along her hairdresser, who was a Roman Catholic, and they still treasure the meeting which they had. Well, we'll go back to the Vatican as soon as we get those pictures. But just finally, Dr. Vinjamuri, as we head into this weekend of diplomacy, obviously the world focus is on COP26. How optimistic should we be that there might actually be significant steps forward in the battle against climate change?
I think just the fact that that COP26 is going forward on the back of what has been a brutal pandemic that is still ongoing, which has really galvanized global attention around the need to take the reins and really drive forward on the climate question, regardless of what announcements come out. Simply the momentum, the publicity, the fact that we all fear missing out of a climate change summit in Glasgow in November is extraordinary. I am optimistic. I think that that the leaders want this to be successful, that they will make pledges, and there will certainly be things that aren't happening as fast as they should have. And the key thing here really is, as we've heard from Martin Wolf and others, it's not only when will the targets for hitting net zero be, but how quickly will the developed countries move towards those, and those pledges on climate financing, they're absolutely critical. But again, the summit is there as much to mobilize civil society, public opinion, state leadership, public-private partnerships, and I think all of those things will be very much on display, and I think it's going to be absolutely critical.
And Michele Geraci, optimistic or pessimistic about COP26?
We need to be optimistic because really there is no time. I'm working closely to my former professor at MIT, who developed a climate change model, and we are showing leaders around. We're showing the model to leaders around the world to basically tell them, if you don't act, this is what's going to happen to your city. And the thing that they most react to is when they see their own hometown underwater, from Venice to Shanghai. That really gets their attention to act.
Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. And of course, a broadcast message from the Pope this morning, pretty much on the same theme, but also making the point that it's not just down to governments, it's down to individuals.